let's move on to this sort of meritocracy view and issues with that. So the first thing that needs to be very clear is that there is a difference between value you contribute to society and merit. They're not the same thing. The meritocratic distribution theory and the value distribution theory that's more capitalistic don't reduce to the same thing. Two different people can be working on the same project and one can work far harder than the other, and then the person who put in less effort can succeed, and the person who put in more effort can fail. You can imagine two people trying to invent the light bulb for the first time, and one of them works 13 hours a day, sacrifices his family life, just busts his butt, non-stop. And the other person thinks about it, but has a lot of time off. Works maybe 4 hours a day, but the person who's being lazy, working 4 hours a day, actually comes up with the solution. Well, that person benefited humankind and mankind a lot more than the person who worked really hard but failed. So there is a difference between merit and value. You can pull the two apart, and a theory that rewards value is different than a theory that rewards merit. They are distinct, different things. All right. First problem with the meritocratic view is there's an epistemic problem. It's impossible to know whether or not people are as meritorious as they claim to be, right? Somebody who really suffers and works hard for what they're doing is indistinguishable from a whiner and complainer who doesn't work quite so hard but says they do and says they're a tortured genius, even though they're really not. Merit is hard to gauge. In fact, it's impossible to gauge because we're not other people. One thing that's going to become clear here is those two ideas that I say Hayek introduced earlier. The first one being that you can't hold in your mind everything someone else is capable of, and the second one being that acquisition of additional capabilities of value is a gain for society. The egalitarian view flies more afoul of that second one, where additional abilities you gain help society. And the meritocratic view flies more afoul of the first. Trying to reward people for their merit is going to end up running into all of these problems with saying some people know for a fact what other people should be doing, or how much merit or virtue is in someone else's actions, which is impossible. We just don't know what other people know. Secondly, so beyond that we just can't know people's merit enough to design a good meritocratic system, this eliminates any reason for individuals to use the knowledge that they have that's specific and appropriate to them. Because you're judging people now and rewarding them based on whether or not they're doing the right thing. Well, they obviously can't be deciding whether or not they were the person doing the right thing, using their resources correctly, or everyone would judge, yeah, I did great, I should get a huge reward. Instead, society as a whole, or some group in society, the government, or democratically elected board, someone has to be deciding whether or not that person made the best decision. But that person is the only person who has the knowledge applicable to their situation that would allow them to make the best decision. Knowledge is diffuse like that. If it were in a central board and not in the individual, well, we might as well just have communist central planning. But this is what having a meritocracy requires. It requires judging whether people's decisions were the best ones before we reward them. So the two people who invented the light bulb, maybe the harder working person is doing what a reasonable person would do, and the other person is just throwing things at the wall. Well, the person who was working harder and making the decisions that a reasonable person would make was obviously not making the right decisions, maybe the other guy knew something that the rest of society didn't know. Maybe he had some sort of special insight. But under a meritocratic system, since he's doing things that a rational person or someone who's well educated or what we would as a society say would be the right thing to do would be, since he's not doing that, he shouldn't be rewarded under a good meritocratic framework, which is bad. You shouldn't want to have a system that undermines giving people an incentive to use the knowledge they have to the best of their ability. All right, thirdly, you should actually try to minimize merit in whatever system you have, not maximize it. Now, this sounds very counterintuitive. Merit is a good thing. People should behave virtuously and meritorious. What does Hayek mean by we should try to minimize merit, not reward it more? Well, do you want everyone doing things the hardest way possible? Do you want everyone working so hard and not really caring as much about the results? Or would it be better if people minimized the pain and suffering they underwent, if people minimize the work they have to do in order to get the same result? Well, it's obviously better to minimize the bad thing, to minimize the labor that goes in and try to maximize the output. But if you're rewarding people proportionally to their merit, proportionally to how hard they work, proportionally to how much they sacrifice, you're not giving an incentive there to try to minimize sacrifice. You're actually implementing a system that would maximize the amount of pain people have to go through in order for society to progress, as opposed to a system where you're trying to minimize that pain and maximize the progression and the new things that we generate and have as a result. It's bad to have a system that's designed around giving people a reward for working harder and being virtuous, but not necessarily having results. Another response that he has here is when we interact with individuals, we don't feel an obligation to try to judge how hard they tried, how virtuous they were in pursuing the goal that they had. Instead, in general, when we're not interacting with close family members, we tend to judge people on the basis of results and don't seem to think there's any moral issue with that. If you hire someone to do a job for you, or let's say you say you'll do a job for them if they do a job for you first, it doesn't really matter too much most of the time how hard they tried. What generally matters is whether or not they succeeded and accomplished what they said they were going to do, and the quality of that work, the value that they gave to you. Finally, the idea of rewarding merit eliminates the idea of having work that is meaningful and satisfactory to you. You can imagine a pianist who is asked how much it would take him for him to play, and he would respond, "Oh, I would pay money to play in the big concerts I play, and that's how much I love what I do." Well, it's not meritorious, it's not labor to him. It's not hard work, it's not sacrifice. So he should, under the meritocracy system, not get resources assigned to him, right? No, we're using this example, like the people on the left saying, well, that guy worked 4,000 times as hard as you, or didn't work 4,000 times as hard as you. Why is it fair he gets 4,000 times as much as you? Well, it's because how hard you work, how much you suffer, probably isn't what we should structure society to reward you for. We should pay that piano player even though he loves his job and would pay to do it, because of the value that other people get, because other people are willing to reward him because he gets all of this great stuff. I said finally a moment ago. I don't know why I said that, because I don't mean it. The final thing here, and I think this is very important too, if you peg how much you're going to reward people to merit, to how hard they work, you're pegging that person's individual value to how much they get paid. You're saying we're going to pay you on the basis of how good a person you are. One of the benefits of capitalism, beyond all of the other benefits we just listed, that the rewarding value system has, as opposed to rewarding merit system, is under capitalism, there is, or at least there should be, a general recognition that how much money you make does not reflect your worth as a person in any way. Someone could be a scumbag, lazy person, still make a ton of money. And we know that. And we accept this and understand it. In a system that tries to be a meritocracy and reward people based on how hard they work, tries to reward merit, you create this perception across society that people who make more money are better people inherently, which isn't what we should want. Instead, what we should want is a society where we all recognize that the amount of money you make doesn't mean you're a good person. It doesn't mean you have any additional value. Somebody who's making minimum wage is just as much value as someone who's not. And this is something that a system that a leftist would design would go the other way. Whatever system you would attempt to have to reward people according to how meritorious they would, as judged by society, is sending the impression that this person's a better person. And you can tell because they make more money, because we decided they're better in some way. The amount of money you make, when you look at it, should not at all be a measure of someone's worth or an attempt to be a measure of their worth. What it can be is a measure of how much they helped out other folks, whether that was by being good or by some sort of an accident. Rewarding value, which is what capitalism does. It's how it works. When you go and you sell your labor or sell some resource you have, someone is paying you for it on the basis of how much good it does them. You give people the incentive to use their knowledge in such a way that it serves others and makes their lives better. You don't give the incentive to them to work hard for the sake of working hard, or sacrifice things for the sake of sacrificing things, which is really what the impulse behind a lot of egalitarianism or behind a lot of progressive, right-wing, left-wing, meritocratic views would be. Okay, so that's general summary of the chapter. There are a couple side things that Hayek mentions that I think are interesting ideas that we'll go through pretty quickly here. So the first is he brings up an idea that he calls spirit of democracy, back when we were talking about equality and egalitarianism. And this idea of the spirit of democracy is the idea that we've been talking this whole time about equality as being equality under the law, right? That's the good kind of equality that Hayek's all for and that I'm all for. And that equality, as we mentioned, is completely incommensurate and incompatible with equality of outcomes and opportunity, quality of results, quality of opportunity, whatever. If you have a society where you have equality under the law, but people are super racist, or people are super sexist, and they don't extend the same opportunities to others, that goes against what Hayek calls the spirit of democracy. The idea of the spirit of democracy is taking the idea of equality under the law and then applying it on the individual level. Having individual people, when they're making decisions about who they interact with, who they reward, trying to be impartial and judge people by the same standards and not be biased. When you have the spirit of democracy, the sort of inequalities that arise in society are palatable. That they seem fair, and we deal with them even though sometimes we have envy or we don't like them. But the moment that you have people in society forming into factions and applying different standards depending on what faction you're in, whether you're black or white, male or female, Jew or Greek, whatever the case may be, as soon as you start doing that, you make those inequalities in society much, much less palatable. and you increase the chances, the motivation for people to overthrow the current system and replace it with something that is going to treat people legally differently in order to even out those unfair inequalities. Um, and that's just a fact. We need, in order to maintain just systems, we need people to generally behave justly. The more unjustly people behave, the more impetus we give for government to grow larger and to get involved. So it's important for people to behave justly in order to keep governments small and just, and keep them from getting bigger to the size that they begin violating people's rights. So be good and be just in your normal life. Second other thing is there's nothing wrong with equality that arises naturally. In fact, it's probably good. It's probably better when people have closer to one another's standard of living as opposed to further apart. And when people don't have special benefits that are bestowed upon them by society as a whole. When someone born in the top quintile has the same chance of ending up in the bottom quintile as the top, and someone born in the bottom has the same chance of ending up in the top as the bottom, and so on. Nothing wrong with that. And in fact, Hayek is entirely okay with using equality as a tiebreaker when it comes to making policy decisions. So if there are two different policies that in every other way are equal, they're equally justified, neither of them violates people's rights, we have to choose one of them, it's a good tiebreaker to say, okay, which one is going to decrease inequality more. He's just not okay with using inequality and differences that arise naturally when people interact with one another as a justification for coercion. Not like he says this specifically. He just doesn't think it's justified. He thinks it's more important that we treat people equally under the law than that we use the power of coercion in the state in order to even out differences. And finally, he points out that as we've seen wealth growth in places like the United States, and I think this is very interesting from the time period he's writing from, he seems to think that as wealth has grown in the United States, inequality there has massively decreased. And I'm kind of curious exactly why he thinks that. I wish he had written a longer essay on this. I think this too, but I'm kind of curious where Hayek was coming from, and I'm wondering if this was a more commonly accepted thing at the time, that capitalism in America had decreased wealth inequality more than the older systems in Europe that may have still been entrenched and going on from earlier periods in time. But this, I think, does tend to be true. As societies get wealthier, that tends to pull the very bottom people up far, far more. Their standard of living goes up way more than someone at the top, right? Jeff Bezos, most of his money goes back into Amazon, right? It doesn't actually increase his quality of life. The more money he makes, the more resources go into making things arrive at your house quicker, making better food, making better products for you. It doesn't actually go to him consuming things. So his wealth helps people who are less well off more than it helps him. Whereas as society's wealth grows, people at the bottom do consume a larger proportion of what they get. So the growth in wealth, assuming it's somewhat even, helps people worse off more than people better off. And even if it's uneven, right, it's going to take some time for that unevenness to help the better off folks more than it helps the lower off folks, just because of diminishing marginal utility, sort of. But right, you have less, a little bit more means a lot more to you than someone who has more. So if you give everyone more stuff, it's going to mean a lot more to the person who's less well off, even if you give the person with more stuff a tiny bit more. I'm not sure Hayek makes that exact argument here, but that's the sort of thing I think he's going for when he says look, as wealth grows, we decrease the relative inequality of people in terms of their standard of living. Hayek's final side idea in the chapter is that it's a really bad idea to attempt to justify this sort of egalitarian idea where we're going to redistribute wealth from people who are a lot better off to people who are poorer off. It's bad to justify that idea on the basis of the community owes you something just because you were born into that community, right? You were born in North America, so you're entitled to a certain standard of living as an American. And someone in Africa isn't entitled to it because they weren't born into that community. You didn't do anything to merit the community you were born in. On top of that, by being born into that community, you're already advantaged. So you shouldn't get special rights to things because of where you happen to have been born, either temporally, either throughout time. You're entitled to more because you were born now as opposed to 300 years ago, or in space. You're entitled to more because you were born in the United States than if you were born in North Korea, right? And just because you're born in a richer country doesn't mean you're entitled to a greater share of the wealth. You already got an advantage by being born there in the first place. The only difference between you and someone born in North Korea is that you have more ability to envy because you're able to look around and see that people have more. So that's the only relevant difference that you can see wealth. By having these sorts of policies in place, where you're entitled to a certain level of wealth or standard of living because you're born in a particular country and part of that community, you create, according to Hayek, and I love this argument, you create massive reasons to build up friction between countries, right? You're saying you're entitled to something because you're an American or you're an English person, instead of thinking of people as just human beings. Additionally, you make a huge reason to put up immigration barriers. If you're entitled to things because you're in a wealthy country and you're a member of that wealthy country, well then, aren't a bunch of people going to immigrate and take advantage of the social programs that you have in your country? Yeah, pretty obviously. Well, then aren't people going to clamor for restricting immigration? Also, obviously. So, and once that happens, once countries start keeping other people out, putting up walls, generating, xenophobia and racism between countries, don't you greatly increase the chances of something like another world war or something like an international conflict, right? Now, so that's all stuff that Hayek explicitly says. That's another reason for being against this sort of egalitarian idea on the basis of you're entitled to something by being born in this country. But it's just, now this is something Hayek doesn't say that I want to add as just the stinger for the video, the very end of it. Isn't it the case that the more socialist a country gets, the more you're going to have nationalism reactionaries? Isn't that sort of what we're seeing in the United States today? We're seeing the left getting their way in a lot of things, having a massive welfare state for just straight welfare stuff, Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, all that. And then you have nationalism rising out of that. It's like fertilizer for nationalism. And the nationalists come in and say, well, we need to stop other people from coming in now. They're symbiotic. And the more nationalism grows, the more you have people saying, well, this is for us, for the people here in this country, not other countries. You're going to see socialism grow more too, both in response and also in, well, if we are entitled to things in this country as citizens of this country, shouldn't we have these additional benefits? The left and the right position themselves as opposites, but they just feed on each other. and all too often their ideas reduce to one another's ideas and imply one another's ideas. Those aren't the options. The options are statism or libertarianism. And I will see you in the next video, which hopefully will be fun.